A land divided, the quota system's roots in Bangladesh. Bangladesh, a nation born from struggle, has always grappled with questions of equality and opportunity. Since its independence in 1971, the country has implemented a quota system in education and public sector jobs. This system, designed to uplift disadvantaged communities, reserves a percentage of positions for specific groups, including those historically marginalized. The idea behind the quota system was noble: to level the playing field and ensure representation for all. However, over time it has become a source of contention, dividing Bangladeshi society. Critics argue that the quota system has created reverse discrimination, limiting opportunities for those not covered by it. The quota system has been a topic of debate for decades, with successive governments trying to find a balance between its intended goals and its unintended consequences. In recent years, however, tensions surrounding the issue have reached a boiling point, culminating in widespread protests that have shaken the nation to its core. The spark ignites students rise up against inequality. In April 2018, a seemingly minor incident involving quota reform snowballed into a nationwide movement. Students from Dhaka University, demanding the complete abolition of the quota system, took to the streets, their voices echoing the frustrations of many young Bangladeshis. The students argued that the quota system was outdated and unfair, hindering meritocracy and limiting their career prospects. They demanded a system based on equal opportunity, where talent and hard work, not quotas, would determine their future. The protests, organized primarily through social media, quickly gained momentum, spreading from Dhaka to other universities and cities across Bangladesh. The student-led movement, known as the Quota Reform Movement, struck a chord with a large segment of the population, particularly young people who felt increasingly disenfranchised. A nation-on-edge protests engulfed Bangladesh's streets. As the protests grew in size and intensity, Bangladesh found itself at a standstill. What began as peaceful demonstrations escalated into violent clashes between protesters and law enforcement. Streets were barricaded, businesses were shut down, and a sense of unease gripped the nation. The protesters, mainly students but also joined by others disillusioned with the quota system, demanded a complete overhaul of the system. They argued that the existing quotas were too broad, benefiting some groups at the expense of others, and that they perpetuated a cycle of inequality rather than addressing it. The government, caught off guard by the scale and intensity of the protests, initially responded with force. Security forces used tear gas, rubber bullets, and water cannons to disperse the crowds, leading to numerous injuries and arrests. The government's heavy-handed response only fueled the protesters' anger, further inflaming the situation. The government's response: crackdown and concessions. Faced with mounting pressure and international condemnation, the government eventually adopted a two-pronged approach, cracking down on the protests while simultaneously offering concessions. The government arrested several key protest leaders, accusing them of inciting violence and disrupting public order. At the same time, the government announced a series of measures aimed at addressing the protesters' concerns. These included increasing the number of jobs and educational opportunities available under the merit-based system, reducing the quota reserved for certain groups, and establishing a committee to review the entire quota system. These concessions, however, failed to appease the protesters. They argued that the government's actions were too little, too late, and that they did not address the fundamental issue of discrimination embedded in the quota system. The protests continued, albeit with less intensity, as both sides dug in their heels. Section 5. The economic fallout businesses reel from the unrest. The prolonged protests had a significant impact on Bangladesh's economy. The widespread disruptions to transportation, communication, and business operations resulted in billions of dollars in lost revenue. The garment industry, a crucial pillar of the Bangladeshi economy, was particularly hard hit, with factories forced to shut down due to safety concerns and transportation disruptions. The protests also dented Bangladesh's image as a stable and investor-friendly nation. The uncertainty and instability caused by the unrest led to a decline in foreign investment and tourism, further exacerbating the economic downturn. The economic fallout of the protests disproportionately affected the poor and the working class, many of whom rely on daily wages. The closure of factories and businesses meant lost income for millions of Bangladeshis, pushing them further into poverty and hardship. Section 6. A cry for justice. Human rights concerns take center stage. The government's crackdown on the protests raised serious concerns about human rights violations. There were widespread reports of excessive use of force by law enforcement, arbitrary arrests, and intimidation of journalists and activists. Human rights groups accused the government of using repressive tactics to silence dissent and suppress legitimate grievances. The government defended its actions, arguing that it was necessary to maintain law and order and prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. However, the crackdown drew widespread condemnation from international human rights organizations, who called for an independent investigation into the alleged abuses. The protests and the subsequent crackdown highlighted the challenges Bangladesh faces in balancing security concerns with the protection of fundamental freedoms. The events served as a stark reminder of the fragility of democratic institutions and the importance of upholding human rights, even in times of unrest. Section 7. The world reacts. International pressure mounts on Bangladesh. The anti-quota protests and the government's response drew international attention, with many countries and organizations expressing concern over the violence and human rights violations. The United States, the European Union, and the United Nations urged the Bangladeshi government to exercise restraint, respect freedom of expression, and engage in dialogue with the protesters. Several international human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, issued reports documenting allegations of human rights abuses by Bangladeshi security forces. These reports called for an end to the crackdown and for those responsible for the violence to be held accountable. The international pressure put the Bangladeshi government in a difficult position. On the one hand, it faced domestic pressure to maintain order and stability. On the other hand, it risked damaging its international reputation and jeopardizing crucial foreign aid and investment if it continued its crackdown on the protests. Section 8. Seeking a path forward. Dialogue and compromise as the only way out. As the protests dragged on, it became increasingly clear that neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The government's attempts to suppress the protests only fueled resentment and further polarized society. The protesters, while successful in drawing attention to their grievances, lacked a clear roadmap for achieving their demands. In this context, dialogue and compromise emerged as the only viable path forward. Several civil society groups and prominent individuals attempted to mediate between the government and the protesters, urging both sides to come to the negotiating table and find a peaceful and sustainable solution. The government, recognizing the need to de-escalate the situation, expressed its willingness to engage in dialogue with the protesters. However, it remained firm in its stance that the quota system, while flawed, could not be abolished entirely. The protesters, for their part, showed a willingness to negotiate, but insisted that any solution must address the systemic discrimination embedded in the existing system. Section 9. The long road ahead. Challenges to a lasting solution. Finding a lasting solution to the quota system in Bangladesh is complex. It requires navigating social divisions and balancing demands for equality. Any solution is likely to be met with resistance. The lack of consensus is a major challenge. While the current system is flawed, no clear alternative has broad support. Some advocate for abolition, others for reform. The issue is highly politicized. Political considerations often overshadow genuine attempts at finding a solution. Bangladesh at a crossroads. The urgent need for unity and progress. The anti-quota protests have exposed deep divisions and challenges. Inequality, discrimination, and lack of opportunities are evident. Yet the resilience and dynamism of Bangladeshi youth shine through. Bangladesh stands at a crossroads. The path chosen will shape its future. Repression will hinder progress. Dialogue and compromise are essential. Embrace unity and social justice for a brighter future. Section 11. A brighter future. Hope for a more equitable Bangladesh. The anti-quota protests have served as a wake-up call for Bangladesh. They have forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality and discrimination. The protests have given rise to hope for a more just and equitable Bangladesh. The youth of Bangladesh are no longer content with the status quo. They are demanding a greater say in shaping their future. This newfound activism has the potential to be a powerful force for positive change. The government has shown a willingness to engage in dialogue and address some concerns. While not everyone is satisfied, it represents a step in the right direction. Continued dialogue and compromise are essential for finding a lasting solution. The anti-quota protests have been a necessary chapter in Bangladesh's journey. They have exposed the flaws in the system and the challenges ahead. They have also highlighted the resilience of the human spirit and belief in a better tomorrow. Bangladesh has the potential to emerge from this crisis stronger and more united.